According to a paper by economists at Agusto Consulting, over 25% of the estimated 4.5 trillion naira capital expenditure in the 2022 budgets may not be paid due to Nigeria's financial priority in the 2022 fiscal year. In the report, the founding managing director of the firm, Olabode Agusto, explained that the plan of the Nigerian government, based on the 2022 Appropriation Act, is that the nation intends to spend 14.7 trillion naira in 2022. Now, a breakdown of these funds showed that the plan of the government is to spend 3.9 trillion naira as interest on loans, 0.9 trillion naira on statutory transfers, 41 trillion naira on payroll and unfunded pension, 1.4 trillion naira on other recurrent expenditures, and 4.5 trillion naira on capital expenditure. The report, however, went further to ascertain the amount which the government could raise in 2022. It stated that the government could raise 5.5 trillion naira through revenue, 0.4 trillion naira from external borrowing, 4 trillion naira from the markets, and 4 trillion naira from the Central Bank of Nigeria, making a total of 13.9 trillion naira. On how the government would prioritize its spending of the projected 13.9 trillion naira that it will raise, experts at the consulting firm stated that about 4.5 trillion naira would go as interest on loans, 4.1 trillion naira on payroll and unfunded pensions, 0.8 trillion naira on statutory transfers, and 1.1 trillion naira on other recurrent expenditures. They said Nigeria should be able to fund 3.4 trillion naira out of the planned capital expenditure of 4.5 trillion naira, which is about 75%. Therefore, based on the data made available, the government may not be able to fund approximately 25% of the capital expenditures in the 2022 Appropriation Act in 2022. Now, which could pose a threat, and that forms the basis of our discussion today. This is Business Edge. I am Lekan Onobanjo, standing in for Tolulokpe Adeleru Balogun. You're welcome. And joining me from here in Lagos, Nigeria, is Gospel Obele, Chief Economist, Streetnomics. Good morning to you, Gospel. Thanks for joining us on Business Edge.
Good morning, Lekan. Thank you for having me.
Now, according to findings by Agusto Consulting, 25% of the projected 4.5 trillion naira capital expenditure in the 2022 Appropriation Act may not be funded. Now, why is that so, and what does that mean for the 2022 fiscal year?
Yes, so that simply means that growth and developmental aspirations for the year may not get to see the light of day, primarily because we do not have the necessary investments or plug-in investments, so to say, in the fiscal year. And that's a bit worrisome because it questions heavily on the continuity of economic recovery, especially inclusive recovery. And within the context of evolving geopolitics, and how that also impacts heavily on the government revenue and prospects, scale fiscal imperatives, growth and aspirations as well this year.
Now, in the report submitted, Gospel, the plan of the Nigerian government based on the 2022 Appropriation Act was to spend 14.7 trillion naira in 2022. Now, based on your own evaluation of government spendings, how would you describe the focus of government looking at its allocations in these areas and sectors?
All right. So quite honestly, I mentioned several times that the Nigerian budgeting system in itself needs a reform. Budgets are critical, or if not the most important policy instrument to driving your policy initiatives, development plan, and the like. So it's a central vehicle. And if the dynamics in terms of the design of the budget, in terms of how those monies will be sourced, in terms of where those monies will be spent, and also more importantly, who will be spending, all right, the channels through which those monies will be deployed, all right, all of these dynamics will inform, and the speed of how this whole cycle moves, all of those dynamics will inform the pace of growth and development, especially for inclusion in a particular fiscal year. Technically, the Nigerian budget at 40 to 60 trillion window is still extremely low. I mean, Apple as a brand is close to times 4 to 5 of that value in the sense, almost 70 to 80 trillion, in terms of that. So our budget is still very low when compared to one brand in a developed market. That's to tell you that we need to do a lot more around how we, push spending into the core of the economy. But the catch here is pushing spending into the core. All right. So the current budgetary process is structured, all right, to recycle waste, is structured to fund recurrence, is structured to invest heavily in waste properties or in sectors that are literally dead in the sense, all right, rather than pumping those monies in sectors that have a high potential to scale back investments in terms of returns and productivity in the mainstream of socioeconomics to drive the necessary growth and development. So this is the main worry for concern, and it has been a leveling concern across all forms of administration. So we need a complete budgetary reform to start with, a complete political ideology reform onto how budget is being used, and a complete growth in institutional capacity, institutional effectiveness to take budgets as a critical instrument or tool, all right, to rejig or change the direction of the economy, the Nigerian economy as it stands today. So currently, there is really no hope around how the budget is being deployed, and it stands as a more critical risk because this is the pre-election year, and everything the government will seek to spend on, and in terms of energy and investment now, would be more tilted to what is politically correct for the 2023 elections and all of that. And that's the dilemma we further find ourselves in vis-a-vis all the contextual issues that we have on the table.
In tandem with what you have said, looking at a miniature breakdown of the appropriation now, the federal government is planning to spend about 3.9 trillion naira on interest on loans, 0.9 trillion naira on statutory transfers, 4.1 trillion naira on payroll and unfunded pension, 1.4 trillion naira on other recurring expenditures, and 4.5 trillion naira on capital expenditure. Basically, Gospel, you're saying there's a possible anomaly in these allocations and the focus of the government. And of course, you are saying that it's not evenly spread, if I can just quickly put it that way.
Yes. So it's, number one, not evenly spread. The design, the structure, and the scope of the Nigerian budget is still, on one hand, very little to scale the necessary growth and unlocking for development potentials at an inclusive level, that we need. That's one issue on the table. Secondly, even at this very minute level and small structure, it's still unevenly spread, right? It is designed to keep status quo running. It is designed to fund waste, and it is designed to retain the economy at a very unproductive level. All right. So what you see now is you're spending almost 90% of your capital size in quotes, when you match in terms of relative spending now on budget, on debt servicing, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but the conversation is where are the monies you've borrowed, where are they going into in terms of capital expenditure or recurrent? Are we using those money to pay more salaries and fund waste, or are we using those monies to plug into the direct core productive streams of the economy? Until we can have the later, we may not be able to cycle back for productivity, and we may not be able to expand the Nigerian economy. People talk about the Nigerian economy being the largest economy in Africa, but that's still very, very little an argument, right? That's very myopic an argument when you look at it within the scheme of developmental progress we need to be making right now as a nation. We need to be doing more, all right? In as much as this budget is structurally deformed, we are still not doing much more with the budget that we should be doing.
Okay, all right. Let's look at fund generation now. Nigeria has tried to boost revenue inflow when they have actually focused on taxes, levies, and the likes, different avenues by which they want to generate funds to fund the budget. But then, how do you think they can depend on this to generate these funds, and how sustainable do you think these methods will be?
Yes, the methods are not sustainable because every touch point for government to raise revenue in Nigeria has been more threatening, disenabling than supportive and enabling. All right. So if you want to get more monies or more taxes from your citizens or from your private sector and all of that, you need to do more around enabling their productivity. Until their productivity is enabled, you cannot make more money from them. Until you help a business succeed, you cannot make more money from that business. So the MDAs and the revenue collection agencies are seeking to get more monies from businesses they've not sought, all right, to enable in terms of productivity and the likes. It's already a harsh reality, and you have increasing cost centers for business, but yet you're still seeking to gain more. So there is a conversation around how do we inspire and enable tax compliance, first of all, before you now expand the tax base. But rather, you're trying to enforce tax revenue, and thereby people are seeking to look for smarter ways to evade or, avoid paying taxes and the likes. I don't think it's a very intelligent strategy in the meantime, as much as conventional economics teaches us that taxes are the major point of government revenue. But we can do more. All right, the Nigerian economy has a lot of non-oil focused potentials that, if properly unlocked from farm to market, and then in terms of international competitiveness and all that, we can make much more revenue for ourselves than trying to strangle a little pool of economic agents who are already frustrated, all right, with the disenablers of trying to do business on a daily basis. So we need to do more. More persons are losing jobs. Their salary cuts on the line. Diesel is on the increase. The private sector cannot thrive. You cannot keep extracting taxes from them. It is not sustainable. I'm not trying to say that it is not important. Taxes are not important. I'm trying to say that enable for productivity first for the economic agents, then you have a sort of like a leverage to gain more taxes. In fact, people will be willing. All right. So when you enable for productivity, you also present yourself as accountable, in terms of transparency and relaying what these tax monies are used for. All right. That way, people are much more inspired and encouraged to pay more taxes. And you can even increase the tax rate. If businesses are doing well today, they will not have a problem with paying more taxes. That's the catch.
Well,
and until we start doing that from an enabler's perspective, we are wasting our time, no matter what the conversation sounds like.
Well, by the way, the federal government is hoping to generate 5.5 trillion naira in terms of revenue from external borrowing, 0.4 trillion naira, markets, that's 4 trillion naira, and the central bank, 4 trillion naira also. But then that's another conversation that we'll have at the other side of this break. So just stay with us and I'll be back with you. Now, in case you don't know, capital expenditures are funds used to acquire, upgrade, and maintain physical assets such as property, plants, buildings, technology, or equipment. So if the Nigerian government is planning on funding 75% of capital expenditures, how would the 25% funding deficit be breached? Well, our guest will give an inclination to that even as we go on a break now. We'll return with more discussions on Business Edge. On Business Edge today, we've been dissecting Nigeria's 2022 capital expenditures as said to possibly be under threat. And still with me is Gospel Obele, Chief Economist at Streetnomics. Now, back to you, Gospel. You mentioned the fact that we have the capacity to do more. And based on what we have, Nigeria is expected to fund 3.4 trillion naira out of the planned capital expenditure of 4.5 trillion naira. That's about 75% of funding for capital expenditure. Now, how would you suggest that the 25% funding deficit will be bridged? Because we've talked about various areas that we need to channel our resources and our attention to in order to generate funds. So what are those critical areas you believe we should also look into if we are to bridge this deficit?
So I will look at that conversation from two angles. First off is maximizing what you currently have. We are already at a very, very bad position in terms of our borrowings, in terms of our revenue prospects and all that. And we're not doing well in terms of how we spend. So first off is to review, or, in fact, in the Nigerian space, you don't really, there are items that are not supposed to be on the capital list that are on the capital list. There are items on the recurrent list that should be on the capital list. So we have a problem defining, all right, the buckets of our capital expenditure list. So that is the first place to start, because until you can clearly define and design, you cannot, effectively or efficiently use the resources you have at the moment. And that's a major problem. So even if you close the deficit gap, there is still a potential that those monies will be used wrongly, or it will be misinvested, and all of that, and to not end up yielding the returns we need. And that has been the narrative for years now. So the first thing is to do the first things first, which is redesign and redefine what's on the capital budget list. And then the money, the 75% you already have, how are you spending to ensure that those monies are deployed in critical sector or market areas that have high productivity and high investment returns? All right, until we can start from there and begin to, bring that positive change, that landslide transformation we may not have enough leverage to be able to shoot for 100%. In my own opinion, 75% is a good place to start. Even if you have all the monies now, 75% is a good place to start when you have the proper conceptualization of what you're spending on than having 100% when you do not have a very proper understanding of what you're spending on in terms of capital expenditure.
Now, in all of these discussions, we understand that Nigeria is still owing about 35.5 trillion naira as external debt. And when you look at the local debt, it's standing at about 21 trillion naira. Now, some people are saying that we're still within the healthy threshold. Is that true? What does this mean in the long and short terms in terms of the country's economy? And how do you think the government can reduce the debt burden?
The argument for the lending threshold does not make any sense to me. And the reason is because on the balance side of that threshold, we are really struggling and we are suffering, all right? We're not making as much money. We are vulnerable. We're much more vulnerable than almost any other West African economy to the global narratives or the global events of the day. All right. So it's like a demand and supply side conversation. If you're broken on one side of the value chain, the other value chain would override and sort of suppress the narratives. So, I mean, people who say that we are still below the threshold are just making politically correct arguments, to be on the sort of fair side of their engagement, as it were. But in my own opinion, I think we need to do more around cleaning up our mess and reducing our exposure to those shocks. All right, that is one. The fact that we are owing up to 35 trillion, that will not change anytime soon. That may even skyrocket further because our revenue space has been hampered so bad, by the current geopolitics between Russia and Ukraine, oil shocks and all of that. And we may need to borrow some more. So the conversation of borrowing more is where are you spending to get the right returns? All right, so the conversation of borrowing more is not because we are still below the threshold, but it's actually because seemingly it's the only option Nigeria has now in the short term. But however, if we can set to plug those monies back into the core productive stream of the economy, we would see benefits in the short term. That's depending on how strategic we are with those investments. We will see benefits in the short term instead of non-oil and all of that. And we begin to raise more monies or more revenue streams that can support the current challenge we have right now. And until we can do that effectively, we may not be able to service our debt sustainably. And until you can service your debt sustainably, you are not in a very good place when it comes vis-a-vis the threshold of borrowing. So that's my argument, all right? You cannot make the argument that you are still below the threshold of borrowing. I don't want to sound too technical. Yet, you have a very, very, very disrupted revenue and, poorly managed economy that is literally at the brink of collapse. You cannot have that and still claim to be at the lower threshold of borrowing. You need to have the economy secured for that argument to make sense. That's the conversation here. So Nigeria has to do more with the current resources that you have. How can you deploy them within the current mainstream to scale growth, unlock potential for more revenue stream? That way, the argument for borrowing lower than the threshold makes more sense.
So, final gospel, how do we deal with the issue of hyperinflation, which is also a trend that is affecting businesses and, of course, all the sectors of the economy in the country? How do we tackle it if we are to make any meaningful progress? Most of the progress is that you've mentioned.
Well, I mean, a lot of times when we find ourselves as an economy, it's been as a result of the actions and inactions of economic managers over the years. I won't just say government now, because it trickles down to state government, it trickles down to the whole fabric of both the executive, legislation, and the judiciary. So the whole fabric of economic management, in the sense, has not enabled enough. And the hyperinflation condition we see today has come about as a result of largely the structural deficits as a result of the poor economic management. So you have structural issues lingering on because the economy has not been properly managed. So the only and best sustainable way to get out of hyperinflation is to go back to the drawing board, deal with the structural issues. There is no reason why there should be transferred cost on the value chain because the price of oil increases by 10 to 15 naira. There is no reason why there should be, any form of disrupt in the cost of doing business because the exchange rate is worsening. All right, we should be able to create the necessary self-reliant shocks that can help us, curtail this budget so that it doesn't hit on consumer spending. So unemployment is on the rise, inflation is on the rise, and the economy is literally stagnating in the sense. So I would see the solutions as more structurally driven than policy driven. What we've been trying to do over the years has been using policy solutions to solve structural problems. It doesn't exist anywhere in the world. It's an unintelligent and a flawed model for a developing or an underdeveloped economy like Nigeria. So we need to do more around rethinking the dynamics and committing in terms of discipline now and the right infrastructure to fixing structural issues. Until structural issues are dealt with, inflation will still be on the rise, no matter how much of NPR holdings, how much of politically correct statements our stakeholders or economic managers make in public. We will still be in this mess. Why? Because the average Nigerian and the average business, which are key drivers of economic productivity, are struggling on a day-to-day basis, and they cannot aspire for more because they are on a new level of a poverty trap on a month-on-month basis. So let's deal structurally first, then we can start beginning to think of the key solutions around it.
Whether they are structurally driven or policy-driven solutions that we are profiling to the challenges we are faced with the economy. There's one thing you said that I would that I would have to hold on to, that is going back to the board and re-strategizing. Well, that is if there's a board to even go back to in the first place.
Exactly.
But then thank you so much, Gospel.
Go back to the board.
Definitely. Thank you so much, Gospel, for joining us on the show. Appreciate your presence.
Thank you for having me, Lekan.
Now, in the whole of this discussion, the construction industry, which is a major contributor to the gross domestic product of Nigeria and a barometer for measuring the health of the economy, is the most hit. There is no doubt that more investments need to be made in that area, and aside tax and levies, maybe a joint collaboration with the private sector could suffice. Let's quickly run off on a break. When we return, it will be time for NC4 to watch. Do stay with us. On NC4 to watch, let's quickly let you know that Nigeria's earnings from crude oil dipped by about 75.9 billion naira in February and March this year, despite the increase in global oil prices for the third consecutive month in March 2022. The latest data from the April 2022 monthly oil market report of the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries showed that while oil prices had been on the increase since January this year, while Nigeria's production had been on the decrease. Now, to another one, oil steadied as China vowed to repair the economic damage caused by a spate of lockdowns to combat the spread of COVID-19 and crude supplies disrupted from Libya. Global benchmark Brent was little changed, near $113 a barrel after a 4-day winning run. The impact of the pandemic on China's economy is short-term, and normal conditions will be rapidly restored after the outbreak is contained. A spokesperson for the top economic planner said on Tuesday, a day after the central bank moved to aid individuals and small businesses. We take it to South Africa. On Saturday, it had already become apparent just how much trouble Eskom's generating unit was in at that evening's peak during the Easter long weekend, when electricity demand was more than 5,000 megawatts lower than it would have been on a weekday. The utility could only provide 27,633 megawatts of capacity, and this included the use of 11 open-cycle gas turbines. Renewables contributed just less than 1,500 megawatts. The utility was forced to implement Stage 2 load shedding abruptly on Sunday afternoon, when breakdowns hit critical levels. And finally, the Kenya Revenue Authority wants Parliament to amend the Huduma Number Bill to allow it to access data in the race to nab tax cheats. The taxman wants the proposed law to include access to data that is beyond acquisition of legal information like identity cards or passports. And that's it on today's edition of Business Edge. Don't forget that you can follow us on all social media platforms at News Central TV. You can also download our mobile app on App Store and Play Store, and also visit our website www.newscentral.africa for more conversations there. My name is Lekan Onobanjo. Until next time, have a wonderful day.